I remember the weight of that glass in my hand. Whiskey, barely a finger left, amber catching the bar's dim light, like trapped sunlight from a day that felt impossibly far away. The ice had long since melted, leaving behind something lukewarm and sharp that I couldn't bring myself to finish. Outside, Chicago was settling into that particular kind of autumn cold that seeps through windows and wool coats, the kind that makes you want to stay wherever you are, nursing whatever warmth you can find. The bar wasn't much to look at. One of those neighborhood places that survived on regulars and the occasional lost soul seeking somewhere dark enough to disappear. Red vinyl booths cracked from years of elbows and secrets. A jukebox that only played songs from decades when love felt simpler, or at least more certain. The air hung thick with the smell of beer and something fried, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from the small crowd gathered near the dartboard. I was alone at my corner table, and I should have been watching her, the woman in the red scarf. She was the third one tonight, the third attempt at what Malcolm liked to call his rehabilitation into the dating world. I had orchestrated the approach, as I always did, suggested the opening line, pointed out the subtle signs of interest, nudged him toward her table with the kind of confidence I never seemed to possess for myself. She was beautiful in that effortless way some women are. Dark hair that caught the light when she moved, laugh lines that suggested she smiled often and meant it. The kind of woman who would be good for Malcolm, I told myself. The kind who might help him remember what it felt like to want something again after the wreckage of his marriage. But I wasn't watching her anymore. I was watching him. Malcolm. The way he moved when he thought no one was paying attention, loose-limbed and unconscious of his own grace. He was dancing, if you could call it that. More like swaying to the music that drifted from the speakers, his hands moving in small gestures as he talked to her. There was something about the soft curve of his mouth when he laughed, something unguarded and genuine that made my chest feel tight in a way I didn't want to examine. He kept checking his phone, not in the way people do when they're bored or trying to escape, but like someone who didn't want the night to end. Like he was savoring something he knew was temporary. When he caught my eye across the room, there was that look again, the one that had been happening more often lately, lasting just a second longer than friendship required, carrying something I couldn't name but felt in my bones. I took another sip of the whiskey and felt it burn against the back of my throat. This was supposed to be simple. I was supposed to be helping him move on, helping him find someone who could give him what I couldn't even let myself think about. But sitting there, watching the easy way he smiled at her while his eyes kept finding mine, I felt something shifting inside me, something I had spent years keeping carefully buried. The music changed to something slower, something that made people lean closer together. I watched as she said something that made him laugh, really laugh. And for a moment, I felt that familiar stab of something I told myself was jealousy on his behalf. That's what good friends do, isn't it? They want their friends to be happy, to find connection, to not spend their nights alone in corner booths nursing drinks they don't really want. But I knew I was lying to myself. He excused himself from her table, weaving through the small crowd toward me with that particular walk of his, unhurried but purposeful. When he reached my table, he didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His hair was slightly messed from the dancing, and there was a flush across his cheekbones that could have been from the warmth of the bar or something else entirely. He leaned down, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of whiskey on his breath, close enough that when he spoke, his words felt like they were meant for me alone. "You're better at this than me," he said, and there was something in his voice that made me look up at him fully. "If I were into guys, I'd probably fall for you." He was smiling when he said it. That easy, unconscious smile that suggested the words had slipped out before he'd had time to consider their weight. Like it was a joke between friends, harmless and light, the kind of thing straight men say to each other when they've had just enough to drink to let their guard down. But something in his eyes wasn't joking, and something in my chest cracked open in a way I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. It wasn't the words themselves, though they hung in the air between us like a challenge I didn't know how to meet. It was the way he said them, the way he looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for something I couldn't give him, like he had opened a door neither of us had meant to find. I felt my hand tighten around the glass, felt the last of the whiskey slosh against the sides as something fundamental shifted in the space between us. This was the moment, I realized later, when everything changed. When the careful boundaries I had built around my heart began to crumble, and I started to understand that some kinds of wanting can't be reasoned away or buried beneath good intentions. He was still standing there, still smiling, still waiting for me to laugh it off or make some joke of my own. But I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only sit there feeling like he had reached inside me and touched something I had forgotten existed, something raw and unprotected that I had spent years learning not to need. The woman in the red scarf was still at her table, still beautiful, still everything Malcolm should have wanted. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt seen in a way that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. That night in the bar feels like a lifetime ago now, though it was only the beginning of understanding something I had been running from for longer than I cared to admit. To understand how we got there, how Malcolm's words could crack me open so completely, you have to understand who I was before he moved into the apartment next door, who I had trained myself to be. I am 36 years old, and for most of those years, I have been steady, reliable, the kind of man who pays his bills on time and remembers birthdays and never causes anyone any trouble. I teach high school English at the same school I attended 20 years ago, walking the same hallways where I once dreamed of becoming something extraordinary. Now I stand in front of classrooms full of teenagers and tell them that writing is survival, that words can save you when nothing else will. I believe this, even if I have forgotten how to save myself. My apartment sits on Maple Street, 3 blocks from where I grew up, in one of those Chicago neighborhoods that gentrification hasn't quite reached yet. It's small but comfortable, filled with used books I buy from the shop on the corner and never quite get around to reading. The walls are lined with shelves that sag under the weight of stories I collect like other people collect coins or stamps. Poetry volumes with broken spines. Novels I assign to my students and novels I wish I had the courage to write myself. The silence in that apartment used to feel like peace. I would come home from school, grade papers at my kitchen table, heat up whatever was easiest, and settle into the quiet routine of a life carefully constructed to require nothing from anyone. I had learned to find contentment in small things. A perfect cup of coffee on Sunday mornings. The way light fell across my desk when I was writing lesson plans. The satisfaction of helping a student finally understand why a particular line of poetry mattered. I had friends, the way most adults have friends. Colleagues I would get drinks with after parent-teacher conferences. Former classmates I would run into at the grocery store and exchange pleasantries with. But no one close enough to call when the silence became too heavy. No one who knew that I still wrote poetry in notebooks I kept hidden in my bedroom drawer, or that sometimes I would drive past the coffee shop where I had my heart broken 6 years ago just to see if the pain still felt as sharp. That heartbreak had taught me valuable lessons about wanting, about the danger of letting yourself need someone who could never need you back the same way. David had been kind and confused and ultimately unable to give me anything more than stolen moments and apologies. When it ended, I made myself a promise. I would not want loudly anymore. I would not let myself become someone who waited by the phone or read too much into casual touches or convinced myself that maybe this time would be different. I became an expert at keeping my distance from my own desires. At 26, then 30, then 35, I watched other people fall in love and told myself I was content with the observer's role. Some people are meant for grand romances, I reasoned. Others are meant to be the friend who listens to the stories afterward. I was good at being that friend, safe in that role. Every Sunday, I visit my mother. She lives in the house where I grew up, the one with the front porch that needs painting and the garden she tends with the same methodical care I bring to my lesson plans. We drink coffee and talk about safe things. Her health, which is good for a woman of 73. My work, which she understands just enough to worry about my happiness. The neighborhood, which changes a little more each year, but somehow always feels like home. She has stopped asking about my love life, which is both a relief and a small heartbreak in itself. For years, she would mention eligible teachers at her church or ask if I had met anyone special. The questions became less frequent after I turned 30, then stopped altogether. I think she decided that I was one of those people who was meant to be alone, and that it was kinder not to remind either of us of what I wasn't finding. I had settled into this life, found a rhythm in its predictability, until Malcolm arrived. He moved in on a Tuesday in early September, carrying boxes up the narrow stairs with the help of two friends who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. I watched from my window as they hauled a child's bicycle and a small pink dresser, as he directed them with the patient exhaustion of someone who had been forced to start over and was determined to do it gracefully. That first week, I heard him through the thin walls. Not intentionally, but our apartments shared more than just a hallway. I heard him on the phone with his daughter, his voice soft and patient as he explained why Daddy lived in a different place now, but that she would have her own room when she visited. I heard him unpacking late into the night, the gentle thud of books being placed on shelves, the scrape of furniture being arranged and rearranged until it felt like home. We met properly on a Thursday. I was coming back from school, arms full of essays to grade, when I found him sitting on the front steps looking defeated. His key wouldn't turn in the lock, he explained, and his ex-wife was supposed to drop off their daughter in an hour. He looked like a man who had run out of backup plans. I invited him to wait in my apartment while we called the landlord. He sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I had made too strong, and told me about his life in the careful way people do when they are trying not to seem broken by it. The divorce had been final for 3 months. His daughter Emma was 6 years old and loved dinosaurs and refused to eat anything green. He had been a marketing consultant before, but was thinking about teaching, about finding something that mattered more than quarterly reports. When the landlord finally arrived, Malcolm thanked me with the kind of sincerity that suggested he wasn't used to accepting help from strangers. As he gathered his things to leave, he turned back and asked if I might want to grab dinner sometime. Just as neighbors, he said quickly, just to have someone to talk to who understood the particular loneliness of these old buildings. I said yes before I could think of a reason not to. That dinner became others. Takeout containers shared across my kitchen table while he told me about his marriage, how it had ended not in anger, but in the quiet recognition that they had become strangers living in the same house. How his wife had been the one to finally say what they both knew, that they had been pretending to be happy for too long to remember what the real thing felt like. He talked easily about difficult things, in a way I envied. About missing his daughter when she wasn't there and feeling inadequate when she was. About starting over at 34 and not knowing if he was brave enough to figure out who he was supposed to be next. I listened, offered what comfort I could, and tried not to notice how natural it felt to have someone else's voice filling the spaces in my apartment where silence used to live. Late-night movies became our routine. He would knock on my door around 9, after Emma had gone to bed at his ex-wife's house, and we would watch whatever was streaming while sharing a bottle of wine or a bag of microwave popcorn. He had terrible taste in movies, gravitating toward action films with impossible plots and dialogue that made us both laugh. But sometimes he would choose something quieter, something that required us to pay attention, and in those moments I would catch him looking at me instead of the screen with an expression I didn't know how to interpret. The friendship stretched and deepened in ways I hadn't expected. The careful boundaries I had maintained with other people seemed to dissolve around Malcolm's easy openness. He would text me pictures of things that reminded him of conversations we had shared. He started cooking dinner for both of us on nights when Emma was staying over, claiming he always made too much food anyway. When I had a particularly difficult day at school, he somehow always seemed to know, appearing at my door with coffee or a book he thought I might like, or simply the offer to sit quietly while I graded papers. I told myself it was friendship. Good, uncomplicated friendship with someone who happened to live next door and understand the particular rhythm of loneliness that marked our days. But I began to notice things I shouldn't have been noticing. The way he hummed while he cooked. How he always knocked 3 times, never 2 or 4. The fact that he kept a notebook by his bed and wrote in it sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't recognize it happening, the silence between us began to change. What had once felt comfortable started to feel charged, full of things neither of us was saying. He would reach for the same book at the same time I did, and our hands would brush, and neither of us would move away as quickly as we should have. He would fall asleep during movies, his head tilting toward my shoulder, and I would sit very still until he woke up, not wanting to disturb whatever peace he had found. I started to realize that I was looking forward to his presence in ways that went beyond friendship, that I was arranging my evenings around the possibility of his knock at my door, that when he talked about maybe dating again, about trying to figure out what he wanted in a partner, something in my chest would tighten in a way I recognized and feared. This was how we found ourselves in that bar, with me playing wingman to a man I was quietly, desperately beginning to want in ways I had promised myself I would never want anyone again. This was how his casual words about falling for me could land with such devastating precision, cracking open everything I had spent years keeping carefully closed. The favor came on a Thursday evening in late October, delivered with the kind of casual desperation that only someone like Malcolm could manage. We were sitting in my kitchen, sharing takeout containers of Thai food while rain drummed against the windows, when he set down his chopsticks and looked at me with that particular expression I was learning to recognize. The one that meant he was about to ask for something he wasn't sure I would give. He wanted to try dating again, he said. Women, he clarified quickly, as if there had been some confusion about his intentions. It had been 8 months since the divorce was finalized, and his therapist thought it might be healthy to start putting himself out there again. The problem was, he laughed, running a hand through his hair in that self-deprecating way of his. He had no idea how to do it anymore. He had been married for 7 years, with his ex-wife for 9. The last time he had tried to approach a woman in a bar, he was 25 and considerably more confident than he felt now. Could I come out with him, he asked, be his wingman, just to help him not look like a desperate divorce stumbling through conversations about custody schedules and failed marriages. I was good with people, he said. I understood women. I could help him figure out how to be charming again, how to remember what it felt like to want someone and be wanted in return. I should have said no. Looking back now, I can see how that moment was a crossroads, how saying yes was choosing a path that would lead us both to places we weren't prepared to go. But sitting there, watching him fidget with his napkin while he waited for my answer, I found myself nodding before I could think of all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. Of course, I told him. What else would I say? The first place we went was Murphy's, the same bar where everything would eventually unravel and rebuild itself. But that first night, it felt simple enough. I helped him choose a shirt that brought out the green in his eyes, suggested he order something other than his usual whiskey so he wouldn't seem too comfortable in his habits. We found a spot near the bar where he could survey the room without appearing to lurk, and I pointed out subtle signals of interest. The woman who made eye contact twice. The one who smiled when he looked her way. I watched him approach a redhead who was reading at a corner table, using the opening line we had practiced about the book she was holding. She looked up, smiled, and they began to talk. I ordered another drink and tried to focus on the baseball game playing on the television above the bar, but I found myself glancing back at their table more often than I should have. He was trying, I could see that, leaning forward when she spoke, laughing at her jokes, asking the kinds of questions that showed he was listening. But something felt off, even from across the room. His posture was too careful, his smile too practiced. And every few minutes, his eyes would find mine, like he was checking to make sure I was still there, still watching, still available to rescue him if the conversation went poorly. When he returned to the bar 20 minutes later, he shrugged and ordered another drink. She was nice, he said, but they didn't have much in common. She was a lawyer who worked 60-hour weeks and spent her free time training for marathons. He was looking for something different, something easier. Someone who might understand that his life came with complications now, that he needed patience more than ambition. The second woman was a teacher like me, blonde and soft-spoken, with the kind of smile that suggested she would be good with children. I thought she might be perfect for him, someone who would understand his schedule and his priorities. But when he came back from her table, he seemed even more restless than before. She was lovely, he said, but the conversation felt forced. like they were both trying too hard to find connections that weren't really there. We stayed until closing time, and he didn't approach anyone else. Instead, we talked about his daughter, about my students, about the peculiar loneliness of being adults who had somehow missed the instruction manual for building meaningful relationships. He told me about his marriage, how toward the end they had stopped talking about anything important, how they had become roommates who shared a bed but not their thoughts. I told him about David, more than I had told anyone in years, about how loving someone who couldn't love you back in the same way was like trying to hold water in your hands. The drive home was quiet, full of the comfortable silence that had become natural between us. But as we climbed the stairs to our apartments, he turned to me and said something that should have been a warning. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight, for making me feel like I wasn't doing this alone." There was something in his voice, something grateful and vulnerable that made me look at him more carefully. In the dim light of the hallway, with his hair slightly messed from the evening and his shirt wrinkled from nervous fidgeting, he looked younger than his 34 years, like someone who was still figuring out how to be the person he wanted to become. "You're not alone," I told him, and I meant it in ways I wasn't ready to examine. The next week, it was trivia night at a place called the Brainery, a bookstore cafe that hosted speed dating events and poetry readings and other gatherings for the kind of people who thought meeting someone in a bar was too conventional. Malcolm had found it online and convinced himself that the intellectual atmosphere might attract women who would appreciate his references to books he had actually read and his ability to discuss something other than sports or work. I watched him charm a brunette who taught art therapy and kept a small notebook where she sketched people when she thought they weren't looking. She drew him while they talked, quick, confident strokes that captured something about the way he held his shoulders when he was nervous. When she showed him the sketch, he blushed in a way that made me look away. But again, when their conversation ended, he seemed more relieved than disappointed. She was creative, he said, interesting. But there was something missing, some spark or connection that he couldn't name, but knew he hadn't felt. He spent the rest of the evening at my table, helping me answer questions about literature and film history, making me laugh with his completely wrong guesses about science and geography. We came in third place, which seemed to surprise him more than it should have. He kept saying how smart I was, how he never would have known that Casablanca was filmed in 1942 or that the Nile River flows north. The way he looked at me when I answered the harder questions was different from the way he had looked at the women he was supposed to be charming. More focused, more genuine. Like he was seeing something in me he hadn't noticed before. The bookstore speed dating event was where things began to shift in ways neither of us could ignore. The format was simple: 8 minutes with each person, then move to the next table when a bell rang. I wasn't participating, just there for moral support, sitting at the coffee bar with a book while Malcolm worked his way through a room full of women who read voraciously and had strong opinions about contemporary fiction. I could hear fragments of his conversations from where I sat. He was better at this than he gave himself credit for, I realized. He listened well, asked thoughtful questions, made the kind of self-deprecating jokes that showed confidence rather than insecurity. But I noticed something else, something that made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't want to analyze. He kept looking at me. Not obviously, not in a way that would be rude to the women he was talking to. But I would glance up from my book and catch him watching me, and when our eyes met, he would smile before turning back to his conversation. It happened so often that I began to feel self-conscious, like I was part of his performance in some way I didn't understand. When the evening ended, he had collected 3 phone numbers and what seemed like genuine interest from at least 2 of the women. But as we walked to the car, he seemed distracted, almost melancholy. "How did it go?" I asked, though I thought I already knew the answer. He was quiet for a long moment, keys jingling in his hand as we reached his car. "Fine," he said finally. "They were all nice. Smart. The kind of women I should want to call." "Should want," I repeated, and something in my voice made him look at me sharply. We stood there in the parking lot, under the yellow glow of a streetlight, and I watched him struggle with something he couldn't quite put into words. The October air was cold enough that I could see his breath when he sighed, a small cloud that dissipated quickly in the space between us. "One of them," he said slowly, "the one with the red hair who teaches at Northwestern. She told me I seemed distracted, like I was already in love with someone else. He laughed when he said it, but the sound was hollow, uncertain, like he was trying to convince himself it was funny rather than true. What did you tell her? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. That I was just nervous, he said. That I haven't done this in a while. But she looked at me like she didn't believe it, like she could see something I was trying to hide. We drove home in silence after that, both of us lost in thoughts we weren't ready to share. But as we climbed the stairs to our apartments, he stopped at his door and turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. Something raw and confused and almost desperate. Maybe I'm just not looking for the right thing, he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. I stood there with my key in my hand, feeling like he had just told me something important in a language I was only beginning to understand. The hallway felt smaller suddenly, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. What do you think you're looking for? I asked, though part of me was terrified of his answer. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words, trying to decide how much truth he was ready to risk. I don't know yet, he said finally, but I know it's not what I thought it was. He unlocked his door and disappeared inside, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with the echo of his words and the growing certainty that everything between us was about to change in ways neither of us could control. After that night outside his apartment door, something shifted between us. Not suddenly, not in any way that could be measured or defined, but like the slow change of seasons when you don't notice summer ending until you wake up one morning and the air feels different against your skin. We still shared meals and watched movies and talked about our days, but the space between us had become charged with something neither of us was ready to name. I found myself rereading old journals, pages I had written years ago when I still believed that wanting someone might be worth the risk of being broken by them. My handwriting from my 20s looked foreign now, full of certainty and hope that seemed almost naive. But there were passages about David that felt suddenly relevant again, descriptions of how love could creep up on you disguised as friendship, how you could find yourself drowning in feelings you never meant to have. Malcolm started cooking dinner for both of us without asking. I would come home from school to find him in my kitchen, ingredients spread across the counter, the smell of garlic and onions filling the apartment. He would claim he had made too much food anyway, that it didn't make sense to cook for one person when we always ended up eating together. But I began to notice how carefully he chose the meals, how he would remember things I had mentioned liking, how he would set the table with an attention to detail that suggested this meant more to him than simple convenience. There was a night in early November when we fell asleep watching some forgettable movie about time travel and impossible love. I woke up sometime around 3 in the morning to find his head tilted toward my shoulder, his breathing deep and even, one hand resting against my arm, where it had fallen when sleep took him. I should have moved, should have gently woken him and suggested he go to his own bed. Instead, I sat very still, barely breathing, memorizing the weight of him against me and trying not to think about how right it felt. When he woke an hour later, he didn't pull away immediately. For a moment that felt like eternity, we sat there in the blue glow of the television, neither of us acknowledging what had happened, but neither willing to break the spell by moving. When he finally did sit up, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something soft and confused, and almost apologetic. "Sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to fall asleep on you." "It's okay," I told him, though my voice came out rougher than I intended. "You looked like you needed the rest." But it wasn't okay, not really. Because I had liked it too much, had felt too comfortable with his weight against me, had wanted to reach up and smooth the hair that had fallen across his forehead. I was beginning to notice things I shouldn't have been noticing, to want things I had no right to want from a man who was trying to figure out how to date women again. I started paying attention to the quiet ways he sought my approval, how he would ask my opinion about the clothes he wore, about books he was thinking of reading, about whether a text message sounded too eager or not interested enough. He bought a new cologne and asked me what I thought, standing close enough that I had to step back to breathe properly. He changed his haircut and seemed genuinely anxious until I told him it looked good. One evening when Emma was staying with him, I went to his apartment to return a book he had lent me. I knocked softly, not wanting to disturb his daughter's bedtime routine. But when he didn't answer, I used the spare key he had given me weeks earlier. I found him in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of a small bed covered in dinosaur sheets, singing to her in a voice so gentle it made my chest ache. He was singing something I didn't recognize, maybe something he had made up, about brave little dinosaurs and magical forests. His whole demeanor was different in that moment, unguarded in a way I had never seen before. The careful charm he used with everyone else was gone, replaced by something pure and instinctive and utterly genuine. Emma was already asleep, but he finished the song anyway, brushing her hair back from her forehead with infinite tenderness. When he turned and saw me standing in the doorway, he didn't look embarrassed or annoyed by the intrusion. Instead, he smiled, that real smile I was learning to treasure, and gestured for me to follow him to the living room. We sat on his couch, speaking in whispers so we wouldn't wake his daughter, and for the first time since I had known him, I felt like I was seeing who he really was underneath all the uncertainty and performance. That night opened something between us, some door we had been circling around without realizing it. We began to talk about things we had never shared before, histories and hurts and dreams we had buried so deep we had almost forgotten they existed. He told me about his marriage, how he had proposed because it seemed like the natural next step rather than because he couldn't imagine living without her. How they had been friends who became lovers who became strangers, trying so hard to build something sustainable that they forgot to make sure it was something they actually wanted. I married young because it felt like the right thing to do, he said one night as we walked through the neighborhood after dinner. Everyone expected it. We had been together for 3 years, lived together for 1. Her parents loved me. My parents loved her. It seemed selfish to want more than that, to need some kind of passion or electricity that probably only existed in movies anyway. He paused at the corner where our street intersected with the main road, hands deep in his pockets, breath visible in the November air. But I think I knew even then that something was missing. I just didn't know what it was supposed to feel like when it wasn't missing. 2 weeks later, sitting in my kitchen while rain drummed against the windows, I found myself telling him about David, about falling in love at 19 with my roommate's older brother, about thinking I had found someone who understood me in ways no one ever had before, about the 6 months of stolen moments and secret meetings and promises that felt real until they weren't anymore. He told me he wasn't ready to choose me over the life he thought he was supposed to want, I said, surprised by how much it still hurt to say those words out loud. That he cared about me but couldn't risk everything for something that might not last. I thought if I was patient enough, if I was understanding enough, he would eventually realize that what we had was worth fighting for. Malcolm listened without interrupting, without trying to offer solutions or comfort, just letting me speak words I had never said to anyone else. When I finished, he reached across the table and covered my hand with his, a gesture so natural and necessary that neither of us commented on it. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "that he made you feel like loving him was asking for too much." The casual intimacy of that moment, the way his thumb moved across my knuckles while he spoke, should have been a warning. But I was beginning to lose track of all the lines I had drawn for myself, all the careful boundaries that were supposed to keep me safe from wanting things I couldn't have. We started taking long drives late at night when neither of us could sleep. Down Lakeshore Drive with the windows cracked and music playing softly, talking about books and movies and the strange loneliness of being adults who felt like they were still waiting for their real lives to begin. He would reach over and adjust the radio, and his hand would brush mine on the gear shift, and neither of us would acknowledge the electric shock of that contact. There was a night when he told me about the panic attacks he had started having after the divorce, how sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night convinced he had made a terrible mistake, that he had thrown away something good because he was too confused to appreciate what he had. I told him about the poetry I still wrote in secret, about the novel I had started and abandoned a dozen times because I was too afraid of failing to risk trying. These conversations felt like confessions, like we were trading pieces of ourselves we had never offered to anyone else. The space between us and the car seemed to shrink with each shared secret, until I was hyper-aware of every shift in his posture, every glance in my direction, every moment when his attention focused on me with an intensity that made my heart race. I told myself it was nothing, that he was straight and confused and reaching out to me because I was safe, because I wouldn't complicate his already complicated life with expectations or demands. That the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't known existed, was just curiosity about a friendship that had become more important to him than he had expected. But I was lying to myself, and somewhere deep down, I knew it. The night everything changed started like any other. Malcolm had picked up dinner from the Thai place we both loved, and we were eating on my couch while some documentary about ocean life played in the background. Emma was staying with her mother for the week, so he had been spending even more time at my apartment, claiming his place felt too quiet without her laughter filling the rooms. We were talking about his job search, how he was thinking seriously about trying to teach high school history, when he suddenly went quiet. I looked over to find him watching me with that expression I was learning to recognize, the one that meant he was working up the courage to say something important. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and there was something different in his voice, something vulnerable and uncertain that made me put down my fork and give him my full attention. "Of course," I said, though part of me was afraid of what he might want to know. He was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hands, then up at me, then away again. The documentary played in the background, something about whales and their mysterious songs, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and the words hit me like a physical blow. "Why does it feel different when I'm with you?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us was ready to face. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he was searching my face for answers I didn't know how to give. This was the moment I had been both dreading and hoping for, the moment when all our careful pretending would finally collapse under the weight of what we had been trying so hard not to acknowledge. I didn't answer him, couldn't answer him, because the truth was too big and too dangerous and too much like every mistake I had promised myself I would never make again. But I didn't look away either, and in that silence, something fundamental shifted between us, something that would make it impossible to go back to pretending we were just friends who happened to spend all our time together. "Different how?" I finally managed to ask, though we both knew what he meant. He leaned closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough that when he spoke, I could feel his breath against my cheek. "Like I've been looking for something my whole life without knowing what it was," he said. "And now I think I might have found it." The weeks after Malcolm's question about why it felt different when he was with me passed in a strange kind of suspension, like we were both holding our breath and waiting for something to break. That moment on my couch, when he said he thought he might have found what he had been looking for his whole life, hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross. We didn't talk about it directly. We went back to our routines, sharing meals and watching movies and taking those long drives through the city when sleep wouldn't come. But something fundamental had shifted. The casual touches that had once seemed natural now felt charged with meaning. The silences between us grew heavier, full of things we weren't saying but couldn't stop thinking. I caught him watching me more often, his gaze lingering on my face when he thought I wasn't paying attention. When I would look up from grading papers to find him staring, he would look away quickly, but not before I saw something in his eyes that made my chest tight with want and terror in equal measure. In late November, he started dating again. Seriously this time, he said, not just the half-hearted attempts at bars and speed dating events. He signed up for a dating app, spent hours crafting a profile that emphasized his love of reading and his role as a devoted father. He showed me the photos he was considering, asking which ones made him look approachable but not desperate, confident but not arrogant. I helped him, because what else could I do? I watched him get ready for dates, offering opinions on shirts and cologne while something inside me slowly twisted into knots. I listened to him rehearse conversations about his interests and his goals, about what he was looking for in a partner. I was good at this, just like I had been good at being his wingman. I could separate my own feelings from what he needed from me as a friend. At least, I told myself I could. The first woman he went out with was named Sarah, A librarian with kind eyes and a laugh that I could hear through the thin walls when he brought her back to his apartment after their third date. I sat in my own living room, trying to focus on the novel I was reading while sounds of their conversation drifted through the walls, and I understood for the first time what jealousy actually felt like. Not the abstract concept I had read about in books, but the physical reality of it. The way it could make your skin feel too tight and your stomach turn over like you were falling. Sarah lasted a month. She was everything that should have been perfect for him, Malcolm told me after they stopped seeing each other. Smart and funny and good with kids. She even liked the same movies he did, shared his taste in books. But something was missing, he said, that spark or connection he had hoped would develop over time. He cared about her, but caring wasn't enough when he knew what it felt like to really want someone. The way he said it, looking directly at me while he spoke, made it clear he wasn't just talking about Sarah. Then there was Jennifer, a marketing director who shared his love of hiking and had a smile that could light up a room. She lasted 6 weeks, through Thanksgiving and into December, long enough that I started to think maybe this was it. Maybe he had found whatever he was looking for with someone who could give it back to him without complications. But on a Tuesday night in early December, I heard him through the walls again, this time arguing on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but his voice carried a frustration and sadness that made me want to knock on his door and ask if he was okay. I didn't, because I was learning the difference between what Malcolm needed from me as a friend and what I wanted to give him as something more than that. The argument was with Jennifer, I learned later. She had confronted him about the same thing the woman at the speed dating event had noticed, that he seemed distracted, like he was always thinking about someone else. She was tired of feeling like she was competing with a ghost, she told him. Either he was ready to be present in their relationship, or they should stop wasting each other's time. He had tried to reassure her, he said. Tried to convince both of them that whatever distraction she was sensing could be overcome with effort and intention. But when she kissed him that night, all he could think about was how different it felt from what he really wanted, how wrong it seemed to be holding someone while wishing they were someone else. They ended things the next day, quietly and without drama. Jennifer was gracious about it, he told me. She said she hoped he figured out what he was really looking for, and that when he did, he wouldn't be afraid to go after it. I should have been happy for him, should have been ready to help him process another failed relationship and start looking for the next possibility. Instead, I found myself pulling back, spending more evenings alone in my apartment while he dealt with his own confusion. I was tired of being the friend who listened to stories about dates that didn't work out while pretending I didn't know exactly why they weren't working. The night everything changed was a Friday in mid-December. Chicago had been hit with the first real snowstorm of the winter, the kind that made the city look clean and beautiful for about an hour before it turned into gray slush. I was grading final exams at my kitchen table, red pen in hand, when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my apartment. Heavy, uneven footsteps that suggested someone who had been drinking. The knock on my door came at nearly 11 o'clock, not the usual 3 taps, but something more urgent, more desperate. When I opened it, Malcolm was standing in the hallway, snowflakes melting in his hair, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold. His eyes were bright with something that might have been alcohol or might have been tears, and when he looked at me, I felt that familiar electric shock of recognition and want. He was breathless, like he had run up the stairs, and there was something wild in his expression that I had never seen before. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running from something and wasn't sure what to do now that he had caught up with it. "Can I come in?" he asked, though he was already stepping past me into the warmth of my apartment. I closed the door behind him and watched as he paced to my living room, then back toward the kitchen, like he couldn't stand still. His nervous energy filled the space between us, making the air feel thick and charged. "What happened?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything," he said. "My ex called about Christmas plans for Emma. She's getting remarried. Did I tell you that? To the guy she was seeing while we were still married, though she swears nothing happened until after we separated." He ran his hands through his hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. "Then I had another date tonight, with a woman from the app who seemed perfect on paper. We went to dinner, talked about books and travel and all the things you're supposed to talk about. She was beautiful and smart and interested in me, and all I could think about was how much I wished I was at home watching movies with you instead. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because hearing them out loud made everything real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I set down the red pen I had still been holding and looked at him fully, taking in the flush across his cheekbones and the way his hands were shaking slightly. I walked her to her car. He continued, his voice getting quieter, more raw. She asked if I wanted to come back to her place, and I said no. She asked if I was seeing someone else, and I couldn't answer her because I didn't know what to say. He stopped pacing and looked at me directly, his eyes dark with something I recognized and feared and wanted all at once. I keep trying to want someone else, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you're the only one I think about. The silence that followed felt endless. I could hear the radiator clicking in the corner, the sound of cars driving carefully through the snow outside, my own heartbeat loud in my ears. Malcolm stood in the middle of my living room, looking at me like I held the answer to a question he had been afraid to ask, and I felt everything I had been trying to keep buried rising to the surface. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could speak, he crossed the space between us in 2 quick steps. His hands came up to frame my face, and then he was kissing me with a desperation that spoke of months of wanting and uncertainty and fear. The kiss was soft and terrified and inevitable all at once. His lips were cold from the winter air but warmed quickly under mine, and for a moment that felt like eternity, I let myself fall into it. Let myself feel what it was like to be wanted by him, to have his hands in my hair and his body pressed against mine in ways I had imagined but never allowed myself to hope for. But then reality crashed back in, and I pulled away, trembling. The look on his face, surprised and hurt, and still full of want, nearly broke my resolve. But I had been down this road before, and I knew how it ended. I can't do this, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I can't be your experiment, Malcolm. I can't be the person you try on while you figure out who you really are. He stepped back like I had slapped him, his hands falling to his sides. That's not what this is, he said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the confusion that had been driving him for months. Isn't it? I asked. You've been trying to date women for months, trying to find something that feels right. And now you're here, drunk and upset about your ex getting remarried, telling me I'm the only one you think about. How is that not exactly what it was with David? How is this not you reaching for the closest safe person when everything else feels too complicated? The words came out harsher than I had intended, but I needed him to understand what he was asking of me. I needed him to know that this wasn't a game I could play, not when the stakes were this high. His eyes filled with something raw and honest, something that made him look younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite the emotion I could see him struggling to contain. I don't know what this is yet, he said. I don't know how to want someone the way I want you, or what it means, or where it leads. But I know it's real. And I know it's mine too, not just something I'm borrowing because I'm confused or lonely or scared. He reached for me again, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. I know you've been hurt before. I know someone made you feel like caring about them was asking for too much. But this isn't that. This is me finally understanding what I've been looking for my whole life and being terrified that I'm too late to do anything about it. I wanted to believe him. God, how much I wanted to believe him. But standing there, looking at his face flushed with alcohol and emotion, I couldn't separate what was real from what was just another kind of confusion. I couldn't risk my heart on the possibility that this time might be different. I think you should go, I said quietly. I think you should go home and sleep this off and decide in the morning if this is really what you want or if you're just tired of trying to want something else. The look that crossed his face was like watching him break in real time. But he nodded, slowly, and walked toward the door without arguing. As he reached for the handle, he turned back to me one last time. This isn't going away, Julian, he said. Whatever this is between us, it's not going to disappear just because we're both too scared to name it. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the echo of his words and the lingering warmth of a kiss that had felt like coming home and losing everything all at once. The next morning, I found a piece of paper slipped under my door. Malcolm's handwriting, careful and deliberate, only 2 lines long. I meant it. All of it. And I'll wait until you believe I did. I read those words a dozen times before folding the paper and putting it in the drawer with my poems, next to all the other things I wanted but was too afraid to reach for. The weeks that followed Malcolm's confession and that note slipped under my door passed like a strange kind of winter hibernation. We barely spoke, communicating instead through the careful choreography of people who shared too much space and too much history to avoid each other completely. I would hear his footsteps on the stairs and wait until the sound faded before opening my door. He would check his mailbox when he knew I was at work, leave for his morning runs when my apartment was still dark and quiet. I tried to return to the life I had lived before he moved next door, before I understood what it felt like to want someone with the kind of intensity that made ordinary moments feel electric. I graded papers with more focus than they deserved, planned lessons weeks in advance, and spent my evenings reading novels that couldn't hold my attention. I visited my mother every Sunday as always, listening to her gentle complaints about her neighbors and the weather while I pretended my world hadn't been fundamentally rearranged by a kiss that lasted maybe 30 seconds. But everything echoed now. The silence in my apartment that had once felt peaceful now felt hollow, like a theater after the audience has gone home. I would find myself listening for the sound of Malcolm's voice through the walls, for the familiar rhythm of his footsteps overhead, for any sign that he was still there, still existing in the same space, even if we couldn't exist together. I discovered his coffee mug in my kitchen cabinet, forgotten from one of our countless shared mornings, and I stared at it for a full minute before putting it back where I found it. His scarf was draped over the back of my couch, navy blue wool that still carried the faint scent of his cologne. I left it there too, unable to bring myself to return it, but unable to ignore the way it made my chest tight every time I saw it. Some nights, I took out the notebook where I kept my poems and tried to write about what I was feeling, but the words felt inadequate, too small to contain the scope of what had shifted between us. I wrote about the space between wanting and having, about the particular cruelty of loving someone who might love you back if you were brave enough to let them try. But mostly I wrote about silence, about the weight of things left unsaid, and the way they could fill a room until there was barely space to breathe. Malcolm was unraveling, and I could see it even in our careful avoidance of each other. When I caught glimpses of him in the hallway or through my window as he left for work, his smiles looked forced, practiced rather than genuine. He had stopped going to the coffee shop on the corner where we used to run into each other accidentally on purpose. He avoided the park where we had taken so many of those long walks that had felt like confessions disguised as casual conversation. The few times we did encounter each other, usually when retrieving mail or taking out trash, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not angry, exactly, but something sadder and more resigned, like he was waiting for me to decide something I wasn't sure I had the courage to choose. One Saturday afternoon in January, I was walking through Lincoln Park, taking the long route to the bookstore where I sometimes spent my weekends browsing sections I couldn't afford. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, turning the world into something soft and muffled, when I saw them across the field near the playground. Malcolm was pushing Emma on a swing, her delighted laughter carrying across the distance despite the snow and wind. She was bundled in a pink coat with a hood that kept falling back to reveal her dark hair, so much like her father's. Malcolm looked more relaxed than I had seen him in weeks, his face open and genuine in the way it only was when he was with his daughter. I should have turned around, should have taken the path that would have led me away from them and back to the safe distance I had been maintaining. Instead, I found myself walking closer, drawn by the sight of him being purely himself, without the careful guardedness that had marked all our recent interactions. Emma saw me first, waving enthusiastically from the swing and calling my name loud enough that several other parents turned to look. Malcolm's head snapped up at the sound, and when his eyes found mine across the field, everything else seemed to fall away. The other families, the falling snow, the city beyond the park boundaries. There was just the two of us, looking at each other across 30 yards of snow-covered ground, and the weight of everything we hadn't said. The look we exchanged lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like a conversation we had been avoiding for weeks. I saw longing in his face, and sadness, and something that looked like hope despite everything. When Emma called to me again, asking me to come push her on the swings, Malcolm's expression shifted to something more guarded, more careful. I waved to Emma and smiled, but I turned around and walked away before Malcolm could decide whether to invite me over or pretend he hadn't seen me. I couldn't trust myself to be that close to him, to see him being the father I had fallen in love with watching, without saying things I still wasn't sure I was ready to mean. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in late January. I was making dinner, something simple that would reheat well for the rest of the week, when my mother's number appeared on my screen. She never called on weekdays, never called without a reason, and the sound of her voice, thin and shaky in a way I had never heard before, made my knees weak. She was in the hospital, she said, trying to sound casual about it, but failing. Just a scare, nothing serious, but the doctors wanted to keep her overnight for observation. Her heart had been doing something irregular, skipping beats or racing for no reason, and her neighbor had insisted on calling an ambulance when she mentioned feeling dizzy. I was already reaching for my keys before she finished explaining, already calculating the drive time to Northwestern Memorial and wondering if I should call work to arrange for a substitute. She protested that there was no need for me to rush over, that she would be fine until morning, but her voice carried a fear that made it clear she needed me there whether she could ask for it or not. I was pulling on my coat when I heard the knock at my door. 3 taps, familiar and gentle, followed by Malcolm's voice calling my name. When I opened the door, he was standing in the hallway with a canvas bag in one hand and car keys in the other, dressed like he was ready to go somewhere important. "I heard you on the phone through the wall," he said quietly. "Is everything okay?" The simple kindness in his voice, the fact that he had heard distress and responded without hesitation despite the careful distance we had been maintaining, nearly undid me completely. I explained about my mother, about the hospital and the overnight observation, and watched his expression shift to something soft and concerned. "Let me drive you," he said. "You shouldn't be alone right now." I wanted to say no, wanted to maintain the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish. But standing there, looking at his face and seeing nothing but genuine care and the desire to help, I found myself nodding. The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled with the kind of comfortable silence we had shared before everything became complicated. Malcolm kept the radio low and didn't try to fill the space with conversation, just let me sit with my worry while he navigated the evening traffic with the steady competence I had always admired in him. At the hospital, he stayed in the waiting room while I went up to see my mother, not because I asked him to, but because he seemed to understand instinctively that this was something I needed to do alone first. When I came back down 2 hours later, exhausted and relieved and emotionally drained, he was exactly where I had left him, reading a magazine he couldn't possibly have been interested in. "She's okay," I told him. "They think it was just stress and too much caffeine, but they want to run some tests in the morning to be sure. She's sleeping now." He stood up and put his hand on my shoulder, a touch so gentle and natural that I leaned into it without thinking. When he suggested we go get something to eat before heading home, I realized I hadn't eaten anything since lunch and that the thought of going back to my empty apartment felt impossible. We found a diner a few blocks from the hospital, the kind of place that stayed open all night for people who needed somewhere warm to sit while they waited for news about the people they loved. We ordered coffee and sandwiches neither of us really wanted, and Malcolm listened while I talked about my mother, about the way she had looked so small in the hospital bed, about my fear of losing the only family I had left. I told him things I had never told anyone, about how guilty I felt for not calling her more often, for not visiting more than once a week, for building a life so focused on my own solitude that I sometimes forgot other people needed more from me. He listened without judgment, occasionally reaching across the table to touch my hand when the words became too difficult to say. When we finally drove home, the streets were empty and the city felt hushed in the way it only does in the deep hours of night. Malcolm parked in front of our building and turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out. We sat in the warm car while snow began to fall again, and I realized that this was the most comfortable I had felt in weeks, sitting next to him in the dark while the world outside stayed safely distant. "Thank you," I said finally, "for tonight, for knowing I needed you there even when I couldn't ask for it." He turned to look at me, and in the dim light from the street lamp outside, his face was open and serious and more beautiful than I had any right to notice. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This is what people do when they care about each other." Back in my apartment, we sat on the couch where he had kissed me weeks earlier, the weight of that memory heavy in the space between us. But this felt different, quieter, less desperate, and more certain. We sat in silence while I processed the evening, the relief and fear and exhaustion all mixing together until I couldn't separate one feeling from another. When I finally spoke, the words came out before I could stop them, before I could think about whether they were safe or smart or likely to complicate everything all over again. "You were never supposed to want me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I wanted you from the start." Malcolm didn't smile, didn't try to make light of what I had just admitted or rush to fill the silence with reassurances. Instead, he reached out slowly, carefully, and took my hand in his. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from the cold, and they fit against mine like they had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. "I know," he said simply, "and I'm not going anywhere." We sat like that until dawn began to creep through my windows, not talking about what this meant or where it might lead, just holding hands in the quiet certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. The change didn't happen all at once. It wasn't marked by dramatic conversations or grand gestures, but by the quiet accumulation of small intimacies that slowly rebuilt the space between us. That night, when we sat holding hands until dawn, became the first of many nights when Malcolm didn't go back to his own apartment, when we fell asleep on my couch watching old movies and woke up tangled together like it was the most natural thing in the world. February passed in a series of careful discoveries. The way Malcolm made coffee, stronger than I liked, but somehow perfect when he handed it to me first thing in the morning. How he hummed unconsciously while he read, melodies I didn't recognize but found myself listening for. The fact that he kept a small notebook by the bed and wrote in it sometimes before falling asleep. Thoughts and observations he shared with me when I asked but never felt obligated to explain. My mother recovered completely from her hospital scare, her heart settling back into its normal rhythm with the help of medication and the promise that I would call more often. When I told her about Malcolm, carefully and without many details, she smiled in a way that suggested she had been waiting for this news longer than I realized. "He sounds like a good man," she said simply. "I hope I get to meet him properly someday." Emma's first sleepover at Malcolm's apartment after we started whatever this was happened in March. I had offered to make myself scarce for the weekend, to give them space to navigate this new configuration of their relationship. But Malcolm asked me to stay, said Emma had been asking about me and wondering why she didn't see me around as much anymore. She accepted my presence in her father's life with the easy adaptability of children, treating me like an extension of family from the moment she arrived with her backpack full of books and her favorite stuffed dinosaur. We made pancakes together on Saturday morning while Malcolm dozed on the couch, and she told me seriously that she thought her daddy seemed happier now, less worried about things she couldn't see. That night, after we had tucked Emma into bed and she had extracted promises of more dinosaur stories and pancakes for breakfast, Malcolm and I sat in his living room sharing a bottle of wine and marveling at how easily she had fit into the shape of what we were becoming. "She likes you," he said, as if this was a surprise worth celebrating. "I like her too," I told him, and meant it more than I had expected to. "She's lucky to have you as a father." The look he gave me then was soft with something that might have been love, though neither of us was ready to use that word yet. Instead, he reached for my hand and pulled me closer on the couch until I was sitting against his side with my head on his shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. Winter gave way to spring gradually, the way it always does in Chicago, with false starts and unexpected returns of cold that make you appreciate warmth more when it finally arrives to stay. By April, Malcolm was spending more nights in my apartment than his own, leaving clothes in my dresser and books on my nightstand like he was marking territory he had been invited to claim. We developed routines that felt like the foundation of something lasting. Sunday morning coffee with my mother, who treated Malcolm with the gentle warmth she reserved for people she approved of. Saturday afternoons at the park with Emma, pushing her on swings and reading books under trees that were finally beginning to bud. Quiet evenings grading papers while Malcolm cooked dinner. The comfortable silence of two people who had learned they could share space without needing to fill it with constant conversation. The poems started coming again in April, flowing from my pen like water after a long drought. Not desperate verses about wanting and longing, but quieter pieces about the small joys of domestic life. The way morning light looked different when there was someone else to share it with. The sound of humming from the kitchen while coffee brewed. The particular contentment of falling asleep next to someone who chose to be there every night. I wrote about Emma's laughter and the way Malcolm's face changed when he looked at her, about the casual intimacy of hands touching while reaching for the same book. I wrote about healing and home and the way love could arrive not as a thunderstorm, but as a steady rain that soaked so slowly into the ground you didn't notice until everything around you was blooming. One morning in late April, I woke to the sound of humming from my kitchen and the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. The space in the bed next to me was still warm where Malcolm had been sleeping, and I could hear him moving around quietly, trying not to wake me, but unable to resist the urge to start the day by making us both something warm to drink. When I padded out to the kitchen in bare feet and the t-shirt I had slept in, I found him standing at the counter with his back to me, shoulders relaxed in a way they rarely were when he thought anyone was watching. He was wearing the navy sweater I had bought him for his birthday, the one that brought out the green in his eyes, and his hair was sticking up in the back where my pillow had pressed against it. On the refrigerator, held up with a magnet shaped like a dinosaur, was a drawing Emma had made the weekend before. Two stick figures standing in front of a house, with Daddy and Julian, written in her careful 7-year-old handwriting beneath them. The sight of it, so matter-of-fact and accepting, made my chest tight with something that felt like gratitude and hope combined. Malcolm turned when he heard my footsteps, smiling that easy morning smile that had become as familiar as my own reflection. There were 2 mugs on the counter, steam rising from both, and he handed me mine without asking how I wanted it, because he had learned to make it exactly the way I liked. "Good morning," he said, and leaned over to kiss my temple, casual and warm and completely natural. I took my coffee to the window and stood looking out at the street where we both lived, at the trees that were finally fully green and the neighbors walking their dogs in the soft morning light. Behind me, Malcolm was moving around the kitchen, probably starting breakfast even though it was barely 7 o'clock, humming something that sounded like contentment given melody. Later, when he was in the shower and the apartment was quiet except for the sound of water running, I went to my bedroom and retrieved the notebook where I kept my poems. The worn cover was soft under my fingers, filled now with words that felt complete rather than fragments of things I couldn't name. I carried it to the living room and placed it on the windowsill where the morning light would touch it, where Malcolm would see it when he came looking for me. Some of the poems were about him, about us, about the way we had found each other despite all the reasons we shouldn't have. Others were about Emma, about my mother, about the life I had built in the quiet spaces between wanting and having. But mostly they were about home, about the way it could be a person as much as a place, about learning that love didn't always announce itself with fireworks and grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived quietly, settling into the spaces between ordinary moments until you realized one day that you couldn't imagine your life without it. Outside, the world was blooming again, slow and steady and certain, the way the best things always do. And in the kitchen, Malcolm was humming while he cooked, the sound floating through my apartment like a promise that this was real, that we had built something that would last. We didn't say I love you that morning, or that afternoon, or even that night when we fell asleep with our fingers intertwined and our breathing synchronized. We didn't need to. It was written in the way he made my coffee without asking, in the child's drawing on our refrigerator, in the notebook of finished poems sitting where the light could find them. Some things are too important for words, too true to need saying out loud. Love, when it's real, speaks in the language of presence and choice and the quiet certainty of two people who have decided to build a life together one ordinary morning at a time.